to Politics in the Power. Today's topic is titled Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. What will it cost us and can we stop it? TPP agenda, as we all know, is primarily driven by big business, big corporations and so on. And it offers very little for everyday Australians. So then, is it quite reasonable for us to ask, can we stop the whole thing somehow? Dr. Pat Ranald is coordinator of the Australian Fair Trade Investment Network, or AFTINET. AFTINET advocates for fair trade policies based on human rights, labor rights, and environmental sustainability. Pat holds a PhD in politics and international relations from University of New South Wales. She won the UNSW Humanities Research Center Award for the best doctoral thesis of the year 2000. Her current research interests include Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and other bilateral and regional trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific region.
My organisation, AFTINET, is a network of 60 community organisations and a lot more individuals, including church groups, unions, public health groups, aid and development organisations, environment groups, pensioner and other community groups. And we advocate for fair trade based on human rights, labour rights and environmental sustainability. And our website with a lot of information is aftinet.org.au. So tonight I'm going to focus on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, and how it can be stopped. I'll also mention the China FTA and some other trade agreements at the end, and I'm happy to answer questions about them because the China FTA has been in the news so much this week. So, what will the TPP cost us? Well, to start with, it's a trade agreement, a legally binding trade agreement, being negotiated. It's not yet agreed between 12 Pacific Rim countries, including Australia, New Zealand, the US and Japan. Other countries in the Americas are Canada, Mexico, Chile and Peru, and in the Asia-Pacific, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei and Vietnam. So you can see it's a very wide range of countries, very varied levels of development. Negotiations began in 2010 and we've been campaigning since before then. And they've been missing deadlines since 2012, that's the good news. And they met at the end of July to try and finalise the deal yet again, and they failed to do so yet again. So I'll come back to that good news and what might happen at the end of my talk. The TPP is not really a regional agreement. As you can see, it involves regions on both sides of the Pacific, but it's a sort of coalition of the willing led by the US, with half the countries having bilateral trade agreements with the US, and the US has a strategy of building on bilateral agreements to form regional agreements. Has a sort of template which it keeps adding to. And it's also very much part of the geopolitics of the region because it's part of the strategic turn of the US, the pivot to Asia, which was announced in around 2011-12. And it's also about, and they've been quite open about saying this, they want the US to write the trade rules and the general rules for relations between countries in the Pacific region. So Australia is actually trying to do a balancing act. We're in the TPP mainly, I think, because of the US alliance, and also because China is our largest trading partner. We also have this free trade agreement with China and another agreement involving China and other Asian countries, which I'll mention at the end. So what's in it for Australia? Well, if you look at the economics of it, it's not much, because we already have free trade agreements with the biggest players, US and Japan, and with all but 3 of the other TPP countries. And in fact, a study done by the US Department of Agriculture, which was focusing on agricultural issues at the beginning of this year, showed that for Australia, the gains were zero in the way these studies do, zero increase in GDP after 10 years. So we're told that the main gains will come from what they call removing non-tariff behind the border barriers to trade and creating this seamless production chains and enabling things like trade in services across borders. But this very much depends on your point of view, because one person's behind the border barrier to trade is another person's pharmaceutical benefit scheme, as we'll see. So, like most trade agreements, despite the fact that there have been some consultations, the negotiations are secret. The decision to sign is a cabinet process, not a parliamentary process, and the public, us and Parliament, don't get to see the full text until after the deal is done. We had a recent Senate inquiry which we helped initiate, which condemned this process as secretive and undemocratic and recommended a whole lot of changes, particularly releasing the text before it's signed and a greater role for Parliament. But that doesn't come into force now because the current government won't agree with it, but we've got that, those Senate recommendations. What we do know about the detail of the TPP text comes from leaked documents and industry publications. So these tell us that the US is very much driving the agenda on behalf of its largest export industries, including the pharmaceutical industry, media, IT industries, various services industries, and industries like alcohol and tobacco. There are 29 chapters or topics, and most of these are seeking to change our domestic regulation in ways that suit those corporations but are not really in our interests at all. So these are the costs involved in the TPP. The issue that people have probably heard about the most is that the pharmaceutical companies, the US on behalf of those companies, is seeking stronger monopolies on medicines, and particularly on expensive biologic medicines which are used to treat cancer and other life-threatening diseases. They already have 20-year patents or monopoly rights on these, but they want additional monopoly rights. And this delays the availability of cheaper versions of those medicines. And there's been a very good study done by Dr. Deborah Gleeson and others which shows, looking at 10 of these typical biologic medicines on the PBS now, that even a year's delay in cheaper versions of these medicines would cost the PBS hundreds of millions of dollars. These costs would eventually then be passed on to us at the chemists. So this is a very serious issue which really threatens people's access to medicines in Australia, and it's even worse for those developing countries that are involved in the TPP. Secondly, they want to have another go at actually giving pharmaceutical companies more say in how schemes like the pharmaceutical benefits work, so that they can limit the ways in which governments regulate the price of medicine. In the US, they don't have a pharmaceutical benefit schemes, they can just charge whatever they like for medicines. The changes they want would give pharmaceutical companies more rights to challenge decisions of the PBS and make it more difficult for poorer countries to develop these schemes in the future. The third issue I want to mention is stronger monopoly rights for copyright holders. Now, I think there was an earlier Politics in the Pub which talked about this, but these monopoly rights not only involve paying copyright payments to copyright holders for longer. At the moment, the period that these things have to be paid for is the life of the author plus 70 years. In some cases, for cinematic products, they want to make it 90 years. But they also, the most controversial thing is they want to make internet service providers responsible for monitoring your breaches of copyright. And then that would mean that they would have to monitor you first of all, and then report your breaches of copyright. And this is a very controversial issue. Fourthly, they still want to have a go at Australian content rules in media. They had a go at this in the US Free Trade Agreement, but they want that further reduced, and local content in government purchasing. Fifthly, they want restrictions on government regulation of labelling. They want to have a sort of regional standard for things like food and alcohol labelling. And on tobacco, there's been a move by some governments who want to regulate tobacco use for public or advertising for public health reasons. Those governments said, well, why don't we just exclude tobacco altogether from the rules of the TPP so governments can regulate for public health reasons. Well, the tobacco companies have got very upset about this and they've been lobbying very heavily against it. There's been a huge backlash. So they haven't even agreed to exclude tobacco from those sorts of rules. And then there's the really big one, which covers all these issues. This is the sixth or last issue. That is special rights for foreign investors to be able to sue governments for damages in an international tribunal if a future change in law or policy, if they can argue that that change harms their investment. And that's known as investor-state disputes, or ISDS, but I'll try not to use the jargon too much. It's investor rights to sue governments. So all of this is not about free trade. It's about increasing corporate monopoly rights and reducing the rights of governments to regulate and reducing people's rights. And despite all these increases in corporate rights and despite promises from the US, there's still no firm agreement to ensure that there will be enforceable labour rights or enforceable environmental standards as part of the TPP. These have been left right until the last minute to be finally agreed. Now, just a bit more on ISDS. The Philip Morris Tobacco Company, you've probably heard, is currently using ISDS in an obscure Hong Kong Australia investment agreement to sue the Australian government for damages, billions of dollars of damages over our plain packaging legislation. It was recently discovered that the Australian government's already had to spend $50 million just on legal fees defending this case. It's been going for 4 years and they've just got to the substantive legal issues. As Justice Philip, our High Court Chief Justice French has said, it's not a proper judicial system. These international tribunals are not staffed by independent judges. You can be a judge or an arbitrator 1 month and then act for a company the next month. That's not what we have in Australia as an independent judge. When you become a judge in Australia, you have to stop being a practicing lawyer. And they have no precedents and no appeals. So it's basically a shonky system. And despite promises about safeguards for health, environment and other public welfare regulation, when in recent agreements that have had these safeguards, it hasn't prevented international corporations from taking these cases. So we've got the US pharmaceutical company, Eli Lilly, suing the Canadian government over the refusal to grant a patent for a medicine which wasn't sufficiently different from other medicines. You've got the US Lone Pine mining company suing the Canadian government over environmental regulation of gas mining or fracking. And you've got the French Veolia company, which operates here in Australia as a waste management company, suing the Egyptian government over a contract dispute, and part of what they're claiming damages for is a rise in the minimum wage. Now, if you think about that, why should an international corporation be able to sue a government about a rise in the minimum wage? This is really undermining democracy and sovereignty. And if we look at the latest version of the investment chapter that was leaked, we can see that the Australian government is getting more and more nervous about what they might be sued about. So they tried to get a special exception in this chapter for the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, Medicare and the Therapeutic Goods Administration, but it's not been agreed, particularly by the Americans. And this is very telling. A, it's not been agreed, and B, it begs the question, what other specific institutions' regulation could we be sued about? What about environmental regulation? What about internet regulation? What about the proposed legislation for food labelling in the wake of the contaminated berry scandal? So it's clear that all sorts of institutions and laws and regulations are open to be sued. And all of these are policy issues which should be decided through normal democratic parliamentary processes. They shouldn't be secretly traded off in a trade agreement. Now, after all that bad news about what it's going to cost us, the good news is that community groups in many TPP countries have read the leaks. They've publicised them and pressured TPP governments to say no to many of the US demands. So that's why the negotiations keep dragging on for more than 5 years. Since the collapse of the July negotiations, they still haven't set a date for the next meeting. And there's also a lot of tensions going on right at the end about what are more traditional trade issues like market access and reductions of tariffs on goods, particularly motor vehicles and agriculture. So the two largest players, US and Japan, can't agree about their access to each other's markets in motor vehicles and agriculture, and Mexico and Canada are unhappy because they don't want to lose their preferential access to the US market that they get through the North American Free Trade Agreement. And there's also countries like the New Zealand and Australia who wants more sugar access to the US markets, more access to the US sugar markets, and New Zealand to their dairy markets in US and Canada. The US is very good at refusing to actually grant access to its own markets in these trade deals. They always demand huge concessions from others up front and then don't reveal what they're going to give right till the last minute. So all those tussles are going on, and they're having bilateral meetings to try and resolve them, but they're not resolved yet. The next meeting of trade ministers was expected to be the end of September, but now there's been some talk about it mightn't be till mid-November. Now in Australia, our campaign has really broken through into the mainstream media and into social media like GetUp over the last year. So in addition to AFTI-net groups like the Public Health Association, the AMA, the Choice magazine have been involved in the campaign, and there have been critical front page articles, particularly in the Fairfax press like the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age and the Canberra Times. There have been critical investigations by the 7:30 report, Late Line, and even Channel 10's The Project. And we've had mainstream media commentators writing editorials against the TPP. A lot more people are aware of it, and a lot of people are talking to their politicians, and politicians are starting to respond. So we had in June the formation of a cross-party federal parliamentary group critical of the TPP, led by ALP member Melissa Park, Independent Senator Nick Xenophon, and Green Senator Peter Whish-Wilson. And there have been increasing numbers of community meetings like this, public rallies. There was one at the ALP conference in June, and we had one on Sunday the 23rd of August here in Sydney in Martin Place, which was jointly organised by GetUp and AFTI-net and had several hundred people. So we're saying that the TPP can be stopped, and it's time that our government actually walked away from these negotiations. But if the negotiations continue, we're still pressuring the government to say no to all of the harmful US proposals and to release the final text of the TPP for public and parliamentary discussion before the decision to sign it is made by Cabinet. If the agreement's supposed to be so good, why can't we see it before it's signed? I should say that today the Public Health Association released an open letter to the Trade Minister and the Prime Minister, signed by 150 health experts, calling on the government to keep to the promise that it's had to make because of all the pressure, that it won't agree to the proposals about stronger monopolies for medicines, and it won't agree to ISDS, which it hadn't yet agreed to without those, in the context of those safeguards that I talked about, which we don't think are adequate. But this is very prominent individuals, health professors, professors and prominent people from the medical profession, again placing pressure on the government. So I'm very happy. How am I going for time? Have I? Okay. Right. Well, look, just on the TPP, I've got these yellow leaflets here. Some of you might have seen them before. Who's seen them before? A lot of people. Anyway, for those who haven't, we can distribute them, and they. Okay. And they more or less summarise quite a few of the issues I've been talking about. And I've also got membership leaflets here if anyone wants to join AFTINET and support our work. It doesn't cost much, but every penny helps us. And you can also go to our website and get a lot more information there about the TPP. And we also have links to Facebook and Twitter, so you can like us on Facebook and tweet the latest news. And of course donate to support our work, even if you don't want to join. I'll just say a few words about the China FTA, because it's been in the news so much. The China FTA, of course, was also negotiated in secret. The text was only released in June, even though the end of the negotiations were announced last November. And it's now being examined by two parliamentary committees, a joint standing committee and a Senate committee. And it will go for a vote, but Parliament will only be able to vote on the implementing legislation, not on the whole agreement. The China FTA also has this investor rights to sue government that I talked about. So Chinese investors will have those same rights to sue governments over changes in law or policy, which they perceive as harm their investment. And I also have a copy of an op-ed I did for the Sydney Morning Herald, which looks at the Shenhua mine in the light of the China Free Trade Agreement. The fact that there could be a legal action taken against if the state government makes a decision not to proceed with the mine, and also the impact of the things which have been most controversial about the China FTA, and that is the increase it allows for temporary labour, temporary workers to be brought in to Australia. Now, the government has been in denial about this. It's said it's just like any other trade agreement. There's no increase in temporary workers. But I've been reading trade agreements for 20 years, and there's no other trade agreement I've seen which has these provisions in 4 different places, plus a special memorandum of understanding about it. So it definitely is a change. And it does remove the requirements for employers to test whether local workers are available before employing temporary workers. But the most extraordinary thing about it is the special memorandum of understanding for projects worth over 150 million, which allow a Chinese investor to bring in a large number of temporary workers, and for all of their conditions, including their wages, to be negotiated before they arrive with the Department of Immigration. And the only minimum condition is a special minimum rate which is available for overseas temporary workers, which is currently about $53,000, but it's far below the rates which are paid to equivalent skilled workers, local workers like carpenters or electricians or whatever. So this would mean that these workers would come in tied to one employer, isolated from the rest of the workforce, and with no access to basic collective bargaining rights. So they'd be extremely vulnerable to exploitation. And this does undermine the rights of both these workers and local workers. And there's nothing racist about saying that this is unfair and it undermines workers' rights. I would be saying this if it applied to if it was in any trade agreement. So the government's campaign is very misleading. If these provisions go through, they would be a very bad precedent for other current negotiations like the Australia-India Free Trade Agreement and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is being negotiated between the 10 ASEAN countries, Australia, New Zealand, China, India, Japan and Korea. So I'm happy to answer questions about that, and I'm happy to answer questions about the TPP. Thanks very much for listening.